The walls of Tehran are telling a story the regime never meant to tell. For 47 years, those walls have displayed the images the Islamic Republic chose to show the world. Revolutionary martyrs, war heroes, verses from the Quran, the faces of commanders killed in the name of resistance against America, against Israel, against every external enemy the regime constructed, to explain why the sacrifices it demanded from its people were necessary and righteous and worth making. This year, the Islamic Republic put a different image on those walls, a nearly empty plastic water container, and beneath it, words so stripped of revolutionary language that they read like a confession. There is a water shortage. It is fall, and there is still no rain. The most honest thing the Islamic Republic has said in 47 years of governance is printed on a poster hanging next to the images of its martyrs. And the distance between those two images, between the man who died for the revolution and the empty container that describes what the revolution produced, is the entire story of what is happening in Iran right now. To understand what is collapsing across this country in this moment, you need to understand something that almost no analysis of the current crisis fully confronts. The regime that is watching its capital run dry was not ignorant of water systems. Iran is not a civilization that failed to understand how to manage water. Iran invented one of the most sophisticated underground water management systems in human history, the Qanat. A network of hand-dug underground channels, some extending for dozens of kilometers, designed to tap mountain groundwater and carry it by gravity to distant agricultural plains without losing it to evaporation. The technology is at least 3,000 years old. Ancient Persians engineered qanats that sustained civilizations in some of the most arid territory on Earth. The system worked because it was built with the geography rather than against it. It extracted what could be sustainably extracted. It maintained what could not be replaced. Cities and farms and entire economies were built on the qanat's quiet, patient architecture. Travelers across the ancient world described Iranian gardens and orchards, sustained by water flowing invisibly underground, emerging exactly where it was needed, shared across communities by systems of customary right that had been negotiated and maintained across generations. A civilization that had learned, over 3,000 years, how to live within the limits of its water. Tehran has been inhabited for 3,000 years. It has never run out of water, not until now. Not until the people who claimed to be its protectors replaced the ancient system that worked with a modern system that extracted everything and restored nothing. The IRGC built over 600 dams across Iran in 30 years. Not because hydrologists recommended them, not because environmental scientists assessed them as viable, because each dam was a revenue stream for corporations affiliated with the Revolutionary Guards. The dam construction empire was not adjacent to the regime's financial architecture. T was the regime's financial architecture. Every contract, every project, every kilometer of concrete poured into the wrong river in the wrong location generated money that flowed directly into the institutional structures that kept the IRGC in power. Iran extracts approximately 63 billion cubic meters of groundwater every single year. The country's geography, its rainfall, its snowmelt, its river systems can only return 45 billion cubic meters annually. That gap of nearly 20 billion cubic meters every year has been draining the country's future for 4 straight decades. Aquifers that took millennia to form, built by rainfall accumulating slowly across thousands of years, emptied in a single human generation. And drilling faster into an already emptying system does not produce more water. It accelerates the emptying. More than 1 million wells have been sunk into Iran's underground aquifers over the past 4 decades. The number of extraction points nearly doubled between 2000 and today. The amount of water successfully recovered from those points fell by 18% over the same period. More holes, less water, and a regime that kept drilling because it did not know how to stop without confronting the economic empire built on the destruction. The Gotvan Dam stands as the most complete expression of what that empire produced, built on the Karun River, directly on top of a documented underground salt dome. Engineers submitted written warnings. Geologists explained precisely what would happen when the reservoir filled. The warnings were filed. The dam was built. The reservoir filled. The water dissolved the salt beneath it. The reservoir became saltier than the ocean. The agricultural land downstream, irrigated with brine for years, became barren. Millions of date palms died. One of the most productive agricultural regions in the country was systematically converted into a salt flat by a dam built to generate revenue for the people who were supposed to be protecting the country. That is not incompetence. Incompetence produces mistakes and learns from them. What the Gotvan Dam represents is the deliberate sacrifice of a region's agricultural future to generate income for an institution that valued its own financial architecture more than the land it was destroying. Iran's geography and water resources can sustainably support a maximum population of 50 million people. Iran's population is approaching 100 million. The regime has been attempting to sustain twice the number of people its land can support, using water reserves already depleted beyond any realistic recovery timeline. And the word that best describes where this has arrived is not crisis. Crisis implies a recoverable situation. The word is bankruptcy, water bankruptcy. A state of irreversible structural failure where the damage has become permanent on any human timescale that matters to a living person. Not difficult to reverse, not recoverable with sufficient investment, irreversible. The rain cannot fix water bankruptcy because the groundwater that took millennia to accumulate is gone. You cannot refill in a season what was drained over 40 years. Tehran has grown from under 5 million people in 1979 to 15 million today. Water consumption grew from 346 million cubic meters per year in 1976 to over 1.2 billion cubic meters annually now. The population tripled. Water demand nearly quadrupled. And the supply moved consistently in the opposite direction across the entire same period. The city has been consuming itself slowly since the moment the revolutionary government took control of its water systems. Before this war began, 4 of Tehran's 5 main reservoir dams were already sitting between 6 and 10% of their storage capacity. In hydrology, anything below 10% is classified as dead volume. The water at those depths is so contaminated with silt and sediment that purifying it to drinkable standard becomes technically impossible to sustain at the scale required for a capital city. The Lar Dam, one of the most critical sources for Tehran's water supply, was at 1% of capacity before the first airstrike of this conflict. 1%. Because of 40 years of extraction and the governance of a regime that was enriching uranium while its capital was quietly running out of water. And then the war arrived, and every system already at the edge of collapse was pushed over it simultaneously. Airstrikes targeted Tehran's power grid. When power fails, the water pumps stop, the treatment plants go dark, the distribution systems freeze in place. Outages that were already occurring during nighttime hours before the conflict became continuous events across entire districts around the clock. The southern neighborhoods of Tehran, always the hardest hit by pre-war rationing, are now surviving entirely on water delivered by tanker trucks that cannot operate reliably because fuel is disappearing from a country sitting on some of the largest oil reserves on Earth that cannot refine or distribute its own product under the combined pressure of a naval blockade and sustained strikes on refinery infrastructure. Day zero was a term used to describe what was coming, something to prepare for. It is not coming. It is here, in the capital of the regime that promised to burn the Middle East. But Tehran is not alone. Look at what is happening to the physical landscape of Iran beneath the crisis that the cameras capture. The ground beneath Tehran is sinking, literally dropping as the water beneath it disappears. Decades of extracting groundwater from below the capital's central plains has caused land subsidence across an area that includes roads, residential buildings, and critical infrastructure. Cracks appearing in surfaces, structures destabilizing as the soil shifts. The capital of the Islamic Republic is slowly settling into the void left by the water it spent 4 decades pumping out of existence. Even if the wells were sealed tomorrow and the extraction stopped permanently, the land that has already subsided does not rise again. The geology has changed, the void is real, and the infrastructure built on top of it does not repair itself. A city of 15 million people is settling into the earth it hollowed out, and no diplomatic agreement, no reconstruction fund, and no new government will undo that process. Lake Urmia in northwestern Iran was once the largest saltwater lake in the Middle East. It covered more than 2,300 square miles and sustained ecosystems, regional fisheries, and tourism economies across an entire generation. Satellite imagery shows it has almost completely disappeared. Scattered shallow pools surrounded by vast, barren salt flats where water once stretched to every horizon. The lake did not drain because of this war. It drained because of decisions made over 30 years by a regime that diverted its inflows and overdrew its basin. The Hamoun wetland on the Iranian-Afghan border, covering 1,500 square miles and sustaining agriculture and fishing communities for entire regional populations across generations, has been reduced to a dust basin. The communities that existed because of it have been displaced by the disappearance of the water that made them possible. The Zayandeh River, whose name in Persian means life-giving, has stopped flowing through Isfahan, not reduced to a trickle, stopped. The riverbed running beneath the ancient bridges that have stood for centuries, the bridges that define Isfahan's identity for the entire world, is cracked dry earth. The river's inflow is 6 cubic meters per second. The city's demand is 28 to 30. No engineering intervention closes that gap in any time frame that matters to the people who need water today. And this was true before a single bomb fell on Iranian territory. Mashhad, Iran's second largest city and one of the largest Shia pilgrimage centers in the world, has effectively reached zero. Its 4 main dams dropped below 3% before this conflict reached its current intensity. The Taliban government upstream in Afghanistan completed new dams that reduced the inflow to Mashhad's primary reservoir by 80%. Iran drilled over 400 emergency wells. The groundwater had already been over-extracted for decades. The wells began running dry almost immediately. 4 million people sustained daily life through tanker deliveries and containers carried home by hand. In the city that receives 20 million pilgrims every year, the water is gone. Now place all of this inside the military situation, because what the regime is discovering, with something approaching genuine horror, is that water is not only a civilian crisis, it is a military one. An army exceeding 500,000 active personnel in Middle Eastern summer conditions requires between 15 and 20 liters of water per person per day for hydration, for the hygiene that prevents the battlefield diseases that have historically ended wars faster than enemy fire, for cooling weapon systems, for medical treatment of the wounded. 500,000 active personnel require tens of millions of liters of water every single day just to remain functional as a fighting force. When the infrastructure that provides that water has collapsed, the water comes from tanker trucks, thousands of them, competing for scarce fuel, moving through a highway. Network under satellite surveillance, adding an impossible additional burden to logistics chains already broken by sustained strikes. Reports from frontline positions indicate some units are being issued 20 rounds of ammunition for every 2 soldiers. The logistical chains have been so severely disrupted that field units in some regions are operating without reliable access to drinking water or consistent food supply. An army facing those conditions cannot maintain loyalty, cannot maintain cohesion, cannot maintain the institutional discipline that separates a functioning military from a collection of individuals making individual survival calculations. Regular army soldiers have been reported abandoning positions and returning home. Their explanation, reported by those who spoke to them, carries its own devastating logic. We defend the homeland, not the regime. The distinction between those two things, which the regime has spent 47 years insisting does not exist, is now being made explicitly by the soldiers assigned to protect the regime's survival. A war of attrition requires the ability to sustain your own forces over time. In a country experiencing water bankruptcy, under a naval blockade that has cut its economic lifeline, with its transport network destroyed, that foundational capability does not exist. And the protests are saying what the regime cannot afford to hear. Isfahan's farmers drove tractors into city streets, demanding water legally allocated to their land, but redirected to IRGC-connected industrial operations. Security forces responded with tear gas. The farmers fought back. Images spread across Iranian social media faster than the censorship architecture could suppress them. In Yasuj, residents gathered outside the governor's office and chanted a phrase that no revolutionary doctrine was ever built to answer. Either justice or the gun. We fight. We die. We take back our water. Across all 31 provinces, protests organizing under a banner the regime has no ideology to counter. Water, electricity, life, our basic right. The regime's response to a crisis of this scale and permanence was what it had available. Cloud seeding. Spraying chemicals into the atmosphere to induce rainfall from clouds that did not exist in sufficient quantity. The technology requires clouds. There were not enough clouds. The government printed posters and distributed them across a city where the walls normally show the images of the revolution's sacrifice. The government held prayer sessions. Religious authorities made supplications. Women gathered at the Saleh shrine in Tehran. Faces turned toward the sky, asking God for what their government could not provide. That image, women gathered at a shrine asking God for rain while the government that has governed them for 47 years watches from the walls behind a poster about an empty water container, is not a symbol. It is the operational reality of what water bankruptcy looks like when it arrives in the capital of a regime that built its legitimacy on the claim that it was more capable, more principled, and more committed to Iranian well-being than any alternative. After 47 years of total control over the resources, institutions, and political economy of 90 million people, the Islamic Republic has arrived at the place where the people it governs are praying at shrines because the taps have gone dry. The president of Iran stood in front of his nation and said something no leader of a modern state has said in recorded history. He said the capital city might have to be evacuated, not because of bombs, not because of floods or earthquakes or any external threat the regime could frame as an act of war against the revolution, because there is no water left. He then said the plan to move the capital, a proposal floated by previous governments and never seriously pursued, is no longer optional. It is a necessity. That is not crisis management language. That is a public confession that the government has exhausted every idea available to it except the one idea that would require dismantling the structure that caused the crisis. Confronting the water mafia means dismantling the IRGC's dam construction empire. It means ending the arrangements that have sustained the inner circle for decades, and the regime cannot do that. Because that network is not adjacent to the regime. That network is the regime. The war will eventually end. A ceasefire will eventually be signed. Missiles will stop falling. And when they do, the world will turn its attention to the diplomatic settlement and the reconstruction commitments. and the new regional architecture being negotiated in rooms far from Tehran. Analysts will discuss whether the nuclear framework is verifiable. Economists will project when Iranian oil exports might recover. Diplomats will argue about compensation and sanctions relief, and the conditions under which a new relationship between Iran and the international community might be possible. But behind all of that, persisting through every announcement and every framework and every new agreement, will be the same empty reservoirs, the same depleted aquifers, the same dry riverbeds, the same sinking ground, the same salt flats where Lake Urmia used to sustain a regional ecosystem, the same dust basin where the Hamoon wetland fed communities for generations, the same cracked earth beneath the ancient bridges of Isfahan where a river whose name means life-giving has stopped flowing. The war did not create the water crisis. The ceasefire will not solve it, because the aquifer that took 3,000 years to fill cannot be refilled in a political negotiation. The salt flat that was an agricultural region cannot be made productive again by a diplomatic framework. The subsiding ground beneath Tehran cannot be stabilized by a reconstruction fund, however generously subscribed. The damage is permanent on human timescales. And the new government, the new supreme leader, the new arrangement that comes after the current institutional collapse will inherit a water situation that no political transition can reverse. Iran's greatest existential threat is not the United States Navy. It is not the blockade. It is not the nuclear sites reduced to rubble or the proxy networks that can no longer be supplied. It is water. And the water crisis was built not by any external adversary, but by the specific decisions of the specific people who governed Iran for nearly half a century, and who enriched themselves and their institutions through the systematic destruction of their country's most irreplaceable resource. The ancient Qanat systems that sustained Persian civilization for 3,000 years before the revolution were abandoned in favor of politically connected dam contracts that generated revenue for the revolution's armed wing. The engineering that had sustained this land across millennia was discarded because it could not be converted into a profit stream for the institutional structures that needed financing. The Qanats that still function in the regions where they survived the IRGC's construction empire are still delivering water today, quietly, sustainably, the way they have for 3,000 years. Hey, we're not broken by climate change or by war or by sanctions. They were simply left aside because they could not be turned into a dam construction contract. That exchange, 3,000-year sustainable genius for 40-year profitable destruction, is the transaction that produced the empty containers on the walls, the abandoned shrines filled with women asking God for rain, the government posters where the martyrs used to be, the farmers with tractors demanding the water that was legally theirs, the residents chanting in 31 provinces that they will fight and die to take it back. The Islamic Republic has an answer for every external threat. It has verses and speeches and 47 years of resistance doctrine for every missile and every carrier group and every sanction regime assembled against it. It built its entire claim to governance on the assertion that it could defend the Iranian people against any adversary from the outside world. It had no answer for the adversary it created inside its own borders. It has no answer for what it did to the water. Thirst does not respond to ideology. It does not care about the revolution or the verses on the wall or the images of martyrs hanging next to the empty container poster. It simply arrives. And when it does, the question it asks of a government is the only question that has ever ultimately mattered throughout the entire history of human civilization. What did you do with our water? The containers on the walls of Tehran, empty in the photographs the government itself distributed to tell its people there is a shortage, are the complete answer to 47 years of revolutionary governance. Not the Navy, not the missiles, not the proxies, not the nuclear program. An empty container on a wall that used to show martyrs in the city where the revolution was born, in the country where 3,000 years of civilization learned to coax water from mountains and carry it across deserts and sustain entire populations, in one of the most arid regions on Earth. The water is gone. The answer is in the container, and the regime that put that poster on the wall knows exactly what it means. Do not look away.